Hello, I am Chris Blask. I'm the Vice President of Strategy with Cybeats. You're welcome to episode 57 of Powerhouse Perspectives, where we look at the past, present, future of transparency and in theory from all sorts of different perspectives. And with us today is Richard Thieme. Good to see you, Richard. Thanks for joining us.
Hi, Chris. Great to be with you. Thank you.
And as we are discussing in the green room before this just conversation about things, right? And each of, as you know, and the greatest achievement of my life is the people I know, right? And we share a lot of
Right.
similar contexts. And it's like, what have you done for the last 30, 40, 50 years? What have you done? Really? 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 And you were just talking about JC, our last guest, good mutual friend, JC Vega is just fantastic. And a perfect example of
Top
this
guy. Yeah.
whole community. And because we're all related by cybersecurity, we've been, looking at a lot of shared questions, and they net down, I think, into transparency and honesty, and I think it's the foundationals are almost philosophical things like take it to Plato or in the U.S. the Constitution, freedom of speech, and can these be acted out in a way that is good, right? Does it make the world more profitable, better, freer, more just, or is it the other way around?
Right. Right.
So so from your perspective, as we're saying, with JC as an army person, as you were young and looking at this going from the back, to now, what do you think when you started all this? And Anthony, if you could roll the first questions, and for the viewers, know, Richard and I share a conversation about UFOs and so forth. So
Mhm.
our question for today is like, were they watching us? When you were young, when you were starting in your fantastic career, you know, was the world more or less transparent? Was it easier to figure out what's going on in whichever way you want to take it?
That's a really good place to start, and it actually is identical. We must have a psychic link as well, because it's identical to what I formulated as where we would begin, where I began, and why it is so different. JC made the comment on your last podcast. We don't know what we don't know, and we didn't know what we didn't know, and he rehearsed the history in his experience of computer security and computing. And yeah, that's where it started long ago for me. But there were several epiphanies along the way that were really critical. And they do require a moment about my background. I taught literature at the University of Illinois for 5 years in my 20s. I had degrees in literature from Northwestern and from the University of Chicago, and I loved it. And I was trying to get going writing. And when that didn't work as a livelihood in my 20s, I became an Episcopal clergyman, and I did that for 16 years. And I did it in three different cultures: Hawaii, Utah, and Milwaukee. I used to say Milwaukee was the most exotic of all because they didn't know they were a culture. Epistemology and ontology were identical. They thought what they saw was what was real. And then I left the ministry in order to write and speak full time. And those three modules are all required to understand what I could see. Literature was based on text, and text was based on the printing press as I experienced it. And several hundred years earlier, it had been writing, scribes, etc. Before that, it was just spoken word. Each one of those, what I call instantiations of the technologies of the word, speech, writing, printing, and now then digital came along. And because I knew how text worked, because I had written, because I taught literature, I had a pretty good understanding of the hermeneutics of the text, the deep meaning and structures of it all. And when I went into ministry, that was really important because you didn't have to be a brainless literalist to read the Bible. You could treat the text as worthy of criticism, historical analysis, textual analysis, and that reveals transparent layers of meaning and gets rid of the nonsense. So the way I did religion is you don't have to check your brain at the door. You can continue to think in the modalities that you previously adopted as appropriate to the reality of the day. But each one of those cultures taught me how to interact with a different culture. And that meant understand the presuppositions people brought to the conversation about which they didn't even know. Okay, so Then the critical moment came when I bought an Apple II for my son, who was 12 then, paid $2,000 for the damn thing, floppies, green screen, big blocky print. And we were playing an Infocom game called Hitchhiker Guide to the Galaxy. Just a terrific game. They were geniuses at creating um, a horizon through the text that I realized looked like it was infinite and went in many directions, but it was actually finite and determined by what options they provided in those early days. But it was while playing that game that I had an epiphany. It was that I realized not only was my thinking changing, I was being changed by interacting with the way a computer mediated meaning through text. And it wasn't the same as a book. And because I was uniquely positioned to know the difference between the two, it's kind of like the Terminator on the moon. If it's all white, you see nothing, all black, see nothing. At the edge, you see mountains, rills, craters. And for the moment, you can see the difference in context created by these technologies, which so assimilate people that they don't see them. They disappear. We don't know, as JC said, what we don't know. And that light bulb went on because I realized people were buying computers. Now, this is early day. Marvin Minsky, he had to say when the internet came along as a public event, if you only use one computer, you're like a brain in a bottle. A desktop computer on a table is worthless. It has to be networked. That sounds so obvious now, but it wasn't obvious then. And the network is where thinking is taking place, he said. And that meant if people are going to be even sitting in front of monitors, as I am now with an iMac, and network to others in the world, then what I perceived intuitively was happening to me and my brain will happen to society. And on that cusp, I said, this is a transformational engine, every bit as powerful and dramatic as the printing press or the emergence of speech several thousand years ago, of writing, several thousand years ago, which dramatically transformed our human consciousness and made introspection possible. Like the printing press allowed English to zip from 60,000 words to over a million. And it suddenly became possible to use a wider palette of colors and nuance and understanding to describe the realities that previously had been totally hidden and opaque because we couldn't see them. So that's when I decided, make it short, I had to leave the ministry because they didn't understand what I was talking about when I start writing articles on the transformation of spirituality and religion. And I realized that I would suffocate to death if I accepted the really good job, the best jobs in that Episcopal church that were being offered to me then. I would die because no one wanted to talk about what I now knew was reality. And a lot of people didn't. So I left the ministry to speak and write about how technology was going to transform things. And I did that full time in 1993, which happened to be the first year you could do something commercial on the internet, not just corporate, not just military, academic. And so suddenly there's audiences everywhere who said, what is this thing? What is the internet going to affect my business? I was asked that a lot. And my habit of listening more deeply than many, because ministry trains you to listen to people. If you go in judgmental, and listen to people who come to you, you become compassionate. And you don't hear anybody who you couldn't imagine you doing that if you were them and had the same inputs into your life. So compassion, understanding, and empathy enabled me to address the real questions people were asking, because this really was a paradigm change. I know that word is overused, but that's what I began writing and speaking about. Islands in the Clickstream was a column I was requested to write. Pretty soon it was going to thousands of people in 60 countries. And it was about how the technology was reframing everything about us and our identities, from individual personal identity and who we thought we were, all the way up to geopolitical structures. And at the first DEF CON where I spoke, DEF CON 4, I not only met a lot of hackers who got that I loved and respected them, I also met CIA and NSA people who became my closest friends and introduced me in numerous ways to the machinations of the intelligence community as well as the security world. And so one thing just led to another. That was 1996. And to your point, that description of how things were going to be transformed now looks like kindergarten stuff to me in the face of what I really think AI and other associated technologies is going to do to transform all of those things again. And people don't know it, and they don't even know that they don't know it. End of first rant.
And it's so many points in that, and as we are saying, what an amazing journey, right? And none of us want to be, particularly self-centered if you're a reasonable person, but you have to sort of step outside yourself sometime and look at yourself. It's like that's a strange path, and that's an interesting path, right? And I'm glad you had that one, and that it's so much what you said. So let me similarly let's go all the way back temporally, right? I look at the human species and I see a couple generations to those transformational stages you're talking about, a couple, until the last one, and not dozens, but 10 or 15, looking at 20-year
Right,
generations and so forth to that next one. And then, the one before that, in thousands of years ago, we're talking a couple hundred generations. Enough if one of each of my or your ancestors could all fit in a quite small room, right? Not a
right,
lot of,
right,
and then all the way back to the half a million years or so forth of Homo sapiens is a couples of thousands of generations, and we look at our context and just on the topic we're talking about, the exchange of information, structures of information. I quite often in these sort of content shows or whatever we call them these days will take Mesopotamia because we're familiar with that. The clay tablets. There's literally littered all over the place of people talking about, and exactly, I'm Bob and you're Alice, and there's 13 units of this thing I bought from you. So when I'm
right,
talking supply chain, how we put all this stuff together, the digital transformational AI driven, masses of information world, I quite often step back and say, look, we've been doing these things kind of forever, or at least for thousands of years,
right.
right? And with your journey, and looking in the ecumenical space, people have been, trying to express our spirituality, our relationship with the universe, all for a couple of tens of thousands of years at least, right?
Right.
And as we look at current challenges, and taking it to the present, and Anthony, if you mind rolling that question, is like there's a lot of angst, but in my experience, there's always a lot of angst. And there's at the end of Men in Black, right at the last minute, they're going to have a coffee or something, and the alarms go off, and there's
Yeah.
new Death Star coming. It's like there's always a Death Star to come and destroy the planet, right?
An
Uh,
Archillian battle cruiser, to be exact.
right. But it turns out, I've lived through all of the, end of time things. You remember this one, Paul Ehrlich, Dr. Paul Ehrlich, the population bomb, 1968. I was born in 65, right? So I'm 4 years old watching this little black and white TV with very authoritative figures saying that the Earth can only feed 3.54 billion
Right.
people, and it's
I
currently
remember.
3.52 billion, and that's why 100 million Americans will starve to death in the 70s. And I'm 4. I'm just learning numbers, right? I'm just like, that sucks. But we make 30% more food with 8 billion per person, than we did with 3. And the numbers are actually working out fairly well, right? So in the current world where, influence campaigns, disinformation, misinformation, corrupted information in the public sphere is on everyone's mind. I'm looking around in my little cybersecurity world and seeing mechanisms and technologies that support some of these things that again are not brand new. Right? Societies have been dealing with this for thousands of years. There are mechanisms, in the functions of older societies, in the spiritual and cultural traditions that we can use to when we have the tools. And if two organizations can say to each other, in real time, all the time, on demand, here is the ingredients of our secret sauce of our thing. Because you are a customer, and we already agreed to that, and we have contracts that we've always had that people call each other on the phone and so forth. But we can put that down into the infrastructure and stop thinking about it. In a lot of ways, what we're doing is, living up to our aspirations. Living up to your word. We said we would do this at that time, and we will, but we really will. We'll build it in. So,
Right.
anyways, in the current world, where do you see this technology as an enabler or not? For better,
Well,
advantage?
you spark a couple of thoughts. Number one is that sociologists long ago pointed out that criminality, illegality was an essential component of society. Now, I grew up in Chicago, so there was no mistaking what they meant by that. I remember when Mayor Daley first became mayor, what are you going to do about the mob? And he just said, do you want to have a cup of coffee? Because he knew the mob was there. And I worked with the Daily Machine as a kid in exchange for jobs for 4 years when I went to college at Northwestern. And so much of what I saw was criminal, and some was really criminal. Like Joe Kennedy had to come to town to have a sit down with Sam Giancana because they had a contract on Joe Kennedy because he had gone over the line, and they talked it through, and the family became a very major supporter of Jack Kennedy, and sent suitcases full of money down to West Virginia to show a Catholic could take a Southern state. Every committeeman, every ward healer in South Carolina, I think, no, West Virginia, got a payoff. But I also was at the headquarters Democrats when Kennedy was elected, and I was worried because at 10 o'clock at night he was way behind, and I expressed my anxiety. I was only 16, and this old Paul says, "Is this your first one, kid?" And I said, "Well, yeah." He says, "Kid, don't worry, we got this." I said, "But look at the numbers." He says, "Kid, don't worry, we got this." And the numbers went down, 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 down all the way through the night as they waited for results from downstate to see what they needed to counter. And by the morning, Kennedy was a little, but just enough ahead to take it. And Mayor Daley was the first guest in the Lincoln bedroom. And so they got it. And that's just the world I grew up in. And the fathers of a lot of friends of mine wound up in the papers doing all sorts of things. I grew up on Lakeshore Drive in Chicago, and I suddenly realized, God, the father of almost everybody I knew was doing something illegal. So, what's the point? The point is, you hear an awful lot of fear, uncertainty, and doubt, FUD, about hackers, and the threat is real. Cyber attacks are real, and they cost a lot of money, and they threaten our national security. And this is really key. And I hear from inside all the time, we're not doing enough. We're not stopping it. Part of the question is, uh, can we absorb the costs? It's one thing if the Chinese shut off our lights, period, or everything, which I believe they and others might be able to do right now. But it's another if somebody loses $35 billion, but they have $100 billion. In other words, can the cost be absorbed, like the fee on a credit card? Just pass it along to the customer, and things cost more. Uh, the number of breaches, the cost of the breaches are so high, but they're so far kind of absorbed. They don't usually put big companies out of business. And my understanding is that healthcare entities, which are a major target of uh, what do you call it? Ransomware, pay right away because they have to stay up. Well, the money is there, and we're learning from our current administration. If you need more money, for heaven's sakes, print it. Uh, and need more, print more. So you accept reality as a gray trade-off between black and white. And everything I did, not only in the ministry but in my life, growing up the way I did, told me that a strict, harsh morality was not the way to carry your sword through life. You need to acknowledge the gray, but there are things you can build in to make it more likely that things will work. And I realized when I looked at organizational work, when I was first started working, I was a consultant for a lot of companies. And I realized, just like in the church, there were three characteristics that, if all were present, helped an organization do well. And I realized they also helped an individual do well because they happen to be true of any 12-step program, AA, whatever. And they are mutuality, feedback, and accountability. So you cannot allow yourself to become isolated and alone in your work. You need mutuality, and you need a posse of trustworthy people. And that's key to this whole enterprise is trust. And who can you trust? And in order to evaluate that constantly, as well as to know what's going on in the world, you need feedback. And the feedback loops into and out of various sectors of reality, you know how they've exploded. Data is coming in from all sorts of places. And my understanding of part of what happened to geopolitical structures was due to the fact that borders and boundaries no longer protected nation state entities, as they still call themselves. And the flow of information in and out at the speed at which it flowed rearranged borders, making them porous and bringing them down. And therefore, identities were transformed. And that's why I think we live in a very, very different world. And that's why we need the third leg, accountability. What are not just values, but what is your criteria for excellence? What is it you're trying to do? And how can you keep the whole posse working together, paying attention to feedback, which is kind of, I mean, it's like computer hacking. What is real is being transformed in every nanosecond. And so your system needs frequent feedback in order just to have a clue as to what is real. And that's part of what is afflicting society right now, because people don't know what's real. And therefore, they have to have a framework. So they make it up. And conspiracy theory is the name for all the ways people connect too few dots way too quickly because they don't have the dots and they don't know how to connect them correctly. So they come up with outlandish nonsense. And that does make us very ripe in the current moment for an autocrat to exploit.
Well, and Anthony, if you want to put up the future state, right? Because this, and again, giving everything you've talked about, your experience and the areas you worked in, and mine as well, and I are known, we're very hopefully very self-aware folks, or at least as good as average.
Yeah,
I understand that I have a very Pollyanna, I tend to say, look, yes, it's, there's a storm going on, but, right over there, and in 2 days or 3 minutes or whatnot, if we navigate our spot, we'll be there, and the sun will shine, and there's actually a little beach. And in this, in this world, and keeping it, in the context we are here with, with technology and business, right? That is there a future, right? I debate this in the cognitive space a great deal. A lot of people have a lot of angst. I think everybody out there, whether for personal or business purposes, or the future of themselves and their kids, is there a future state where it either so when I talk about inevitability curves, what I'm really talking about is in the future there's a range of possible states, right?
right.
I mean, inside
Right.
that's where we're going to be. We just are, right? Outside of that, it's just not. That's not. I mean, maybe, but not happening. And a future persistent dystopian, nobody can tell what's going on. We've had over the last number of years, increases in those sort of problems, individually, nationally, globally, as businesses, right? Keeping clear on what's real and what's not. If that increased forever and got to say 100%, then we couldn't walk out the door.
Right.
And I don't. That kind of thing is really a stable future state. I think we're in a process that evens out because, and as I say, businesses need to be able to be really clear with each other. The technology, the infrastructure, and the intellectual structures, as you say, all these technologies are really just expressions of conversations and thoughts, and how we're writing things down as we've done for several thousand years. Into manageable spaces. So we can know that yes, know that substation is not on fire. It really isn't. I'm not pressing that button no matter what you say because I have a system of knowing what's real and what's not.
Hmm.
Or do you think that the future is sustainably more chaotic?
Well, I understand everything you're saying. I think you're right, and I want to take it in a slightly different direction because I just finished a trilogy, three fiction works that I never knew were going to be a trilogy, the Mobius trilogy, um, and it was the death of my closest friends at an agency that precipitated it, and a friend who I think you had Spafford on not long ago.
Yeah,
And the
yeah,
staff
yeah.
called me. He said, "You're talking about writing fiction," and I had to write fiction. I mean, a deputy, shouldn't say who, but a top guy at NSA said, "Richard," this is years ago. He said, "You can't ever discuss what we talk about with you unless you write fiction. Fiction is the only way you can tell the truth." And so I literally had to do that. Um, it's fictionalized, the Mobius trilogy, but it's the life of an intelligence professional and what it does to you to do the work. And I had done a talk called Playing Through the Pain, where over 50 people from Intel security, military, corporate sent in their stories for me to use. And I was reviewing all that material because I'm going to re up that talk because it seems more relevant than ever. And found one from a guy who said, "I sat there crying through your talk. You could hear people audibly sobbing. This is a DEF CON crowd, geeks. You don't usually hear crying at DEF CON because I was describing the impact of the work, intelligence work, but it can be security, it can be other things. Above all, it's the burden of secrets and the challenge to your psyche, to your moral health. You can experience doing security work what they call moral harms. In other words, you have a framework, an ethos that you bring into the work. And I think it was Dan Gear who said to me, "You find out you've signed a contract with the devil after it's too late to do anything about it." Uh, that may sound harsh in light of what you're saying, but there are antidotes to it. But so I want to emphasize the real impacts of the work on people because I've heard so much about it. But when I've asked people what you do to ameliorate that, it sounds very much like what you articulated. In other words, you find a sunny spot. A guy I know who almost had a meltdown dealing with truckloads of bodies after a tsunami in Asia. He said, "You just go to a cafe and you just be with normal people. You be in a situation where you can see the loveliness of people, listen to music, do gardening. Of course, we know exercise, walks, engage with nature. I mean, you're on a boat, right? And I've got a beautiful view of a pond and trees and nothing else out my window at the condo. Thank God. Uh, it's a little cold. I mean, 13 below is too cold to just take a walk around the lake today, but it'll get better. El Nino, our friend, is rearing up again. Uh, the point is, there are things we can do. And Mike Jones just did a podcast with me after 5 weeks in 5 months in treatment for PTSD. And he mentioned, he said, Mobius, uh, the first book of the trilogy, was the only book he took with him because it helped him understand the conflicts he experienced and helped him uh, frame them, understand them, bring them to consciousness so that they could be ameliorated to a degree. And thank God he chose that route. And I've never been more conscious of how many suicides are taking place. So that's the serious side of it. A friend from NSA wrote, "We got an email, general email. Everybody got it. It said, watch each other's backs. Make sure you pay attention." And he said, "Where the hell did this come from?" And then he looked at how many suicides there had been at the agency that week, and it was a significant number. And so, on the one hand, you want to do justice to what it can do to people to have their framework of life, their belief system challenged, their ethos challenged, and to know secrets, to know things, the knowing of which challenges them deeply, even at a fundamental level. Great stories about that too, about what's really real in the world. And it takes a particular approach to all of that, which I think you have and I have. To number one, we love that. Let's admit it. We love being on the edge and being challenged by vectors of reality that then call forth from us our best mental effort to say, what the hell is going on? And and we have these things we can do, and they're all simple and they all are trite. Have loving relationships. Have colleagues you can talk to. Have people you can talk to about the things that are really important. You don't have to go to a therapist or a 12-step group, although I've used both in my time, thank God, and they've been redemptive and productive. Uh, there's ways not out. but ways to not just cope, but transcend those impacts and really get a giggle out of the joy of living at a time that threatens chaos that we intend to forestall in order to maintain the structures of society. Does that
Right.
make
And,
sense?
absolutely. And again, I look back at this long human history. I look back at the short part that I've been able to see myself, and the slightly longer, part I can see through some friends and family, who were, started before me. And yeah, we transcend all sorts of problems all the time. I might be hit by a storm in a few minutes. It's
Right,
okay. There's always a Wogon battleship coming to pave the earth. Arthur Dent makes it. And
right. And
the
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 reason people get on with their happy little lives because they don't know it, said Kay, right?
right.
I could do the
And
whole script from memory.
my last comment, on just to end on resonate with something you said. During the sort of height of the pandemic, everybody's claustrophobic and zooming all the time, right? Everybody's getting into this. And I just shared an article. It wasn't even original piece of mine, and commented at the top. And it was just ridiculous number of people liked and shared and so forth.
Huh?
And all I said was, if you stare at a wild animal, it will attack you, right?
Right,
Move back from your camera a little bit. Look away like a normal human being. Like, even now we're recording this, but you watch the eye movement. Like, we need to realize that we're human. And the thing about what you're saying that keep me, I said, look, spend 5 minutes being colleagues, right? If you only had 25 minutes, you'd still get the whatever task done. So take 30 minutes, talk about cats for 5 minutes. And as we've really seen people adopt that, it gives you a lot of hope for, again, for all of us, right?
right. And
People are
because
reasonable and work out.
these last 30 years have included, I've been so fortunate. You said very odd path, yes. But what I brought to the communities I served as a speaker and writer was what I learned in the ministry. And it was not just empathy to an end. I met a friend at NSA. I was talking about how you create relationships so that the movement of information and emotion back and forth between you, I said that enables me to empower the person so that they become more autonomous, more powerful, and more free. And he said, "Well, we do that at the agency, but we do it to control you." and and he wasn't kidding.
But they mean well. They do mean well. I generally believe that, right? So I know we've taken a lot of your time, and this has been fantastic, Richard. So thank you for everything you've done, right?
Thanks.
And getting to know you better, right? That's what I really enjoyed about this series is looking at people I already know. It's like, what is their entire life context, right? And with
Yeah.
your history, you appreciate that. It's like fascinating bunch of animals we all are.
You couldn't predict it, and if there's a meaningful meaning to the universe, then it somehow infused my life with the trajectory that I have followed intuitively. But there's a good lesson there too. You intuit this is the right thing to do. Trust your perception. Do it.
Right.
Don't surrender. Right.
Don't surrender. Never surrender. So thank you very much. Thanks everybody for your
What a
time today
pleasure.
to watch us
Thanks,
talk about
Chris.
these things. And look forward to Richard spending more time with you and everybody else out there in the world, to come sailing. We'll come
Yeah, you make
out of
the
the boat tomorrow.
margaritas. I'll bring the joy.
And we'll fix the cybersecurity world. Thanks,
Okay.
folks.
Take care.